The park bench had become her sanctuary every Wednesday morning at precisely 9 a.m., where Margaret Chen sat with a small wooden box containing 17 military medals that belonged to men who would never come home. The morning joggers barely glanced at the elderly Asian woman methodically polishing each piece of brass and silver with a soft cloth, treating them like forgotten relics from someone else's war. But when the retired Air Force colonel finally stopped to examine the distinguished flying cross in her weathered hands, his face went completely white as he whispered a name that had been classified for 67 years. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Margaret Chen was 78 years old, born in San Francisco to parents who had immigrated from Taiwan in 1943. Her father had worked as a translator for the U.S. military during World War II, helping American forces communicate with Chinese resistance fighters behind Japanese lines. Her mother had volunteered at the Red Cross, rolling bandages and packing medical supplies for field hospitals across the Pacific Theater. From her earliest memories, Margaret had been surrounded by the weight of military service, the constant presence of uniforms, and the unspoken understanding that some sacrifices were too large for ordinary conversation. She had spent her entire career as a civilian contractor for the Department of Defense, working in records management and personnel files at Travis Air Force Base in California. For 42 years, she had processed transfer orders, maintained classified documentation, and handled the administrative details of military life that kept the massive machinery of national defense running smoothly. Her colleagues knew her as someone who never missed a deadline, never forgot a regulation, and never spoke about the contents of the files she managed with such meticulous care. Margaret's own military connection was deeply personal. She had married Technical Sergeant Robert Chen in 1965, 2 months before his deployment to Vietnam. Robert had been a communications specialist, responsible for maintaining radio contact between forward operating bases and command headquarters. He had written her letters describing the incredible responsibility of being the voice that connected isolated units with the resources they needed to survive. But Robert never came home from his third tour of duty. His helicopter had been shot down over the DMZ in 1968, and his body was never recovered. The wooden box containing the 17 medals had been Margaret's private project for the past 15 years, ever since her retirement from Travis Air Force Base. During her decades of work in personnel records, she had encountered hundreds of cases involving missing servicemen, unidentified remains, and families who had never received closure about their loved one's fate. The medals in her box represented some of the most troubling cases she had encountered. Awards that had been presented to next of kin for servicemen whose bodies had never been found, whose final missions remained classified, whose families had been told only that their sons, brothers, and husbands had died in service to their country. Each medal had its own story, its own mystery, its own family left behind with questions that would never be answered. Margaret had spent countless hours researching each case, reading through declassified mission reports, studying casualty records, and cross-referencing different databases to piece together the final days of these missing men. She had contacted surviving family members when possible, attempting to provide them with any additional information she could gather about their loved ones' service records and final missions. Distinguished Flying Cross that caught Colonel Harrison's attention belonged to Captain James Mitchell, a Navy pilot who had disappeared over the Pacific Ocean in 1957 during a classified reconnaissance mission. According to the official records, Captain Mitchell's F-8 Crusader had experienced mechanical failure approximately 200 miles southwest of Guam, and despite extensive search and rescue operations, neither the aircraft nor the pilot had ever been located. The medal had been awarded posthumously and presented to Mitchell's parents at a ceremony in San Diego, but his mother had died in 1994, and his father had passed away in 1998, leaving behind only a younger sister who had donated their parents' military memorabilia to a veterans organization. Margaret had discovered Captain Mitchell's Distinguished Flying Cross at an estate sale in Sacramento, mixed in with a box of miscellaneous military items that were being sold by someone who clearly had no understanding of their significance. She had paid $12 for the entire box, which had contained several service ribbons, a few unit patches, and Mitchell's medal, still in its original presentation case with the citation signed by the Secretary of the Navy. The citation described Captain Mitchell's exceptional skill and courage during multiple combat missions over North Korea, his innovative tactical approaches to aerial reconnaissance, and his unwavering commitment to gathering intelligence that had saved the lives of countless ground forces. But the citation made no mention of his final mission, the circumstances of his disappearance, or the fact that his loss had been classified at the highest levels of government security. Margaret had spent 3 years researching Captain Mitchell's case, submitting Freedom of Information Act requests, contacting Navy Historical Archives, and attempting to locate any surviving family members who might want to reclaim his medal. She had discovered that Mitchell's younger sister, Patricia, was still alive and living in Portland, Oregon, but every letter Margaret had sent had been returned as undeliverable. The trail had grown cold, and Margaret had begun to fear that Patricia Mitchell might have died without ever knowing that her brother's medal had been recovered. Every Wednesday morning, Margaret brought her wooden box to Meridian Park, choosing a different bench each week, polishing each medal with the same careful attention she had once given to military personnel files. She had developed a ritual of researching one medal per week, spending hours at the public library using their computer terminals to search for new information, contact surviving relatives, or follow up on previously cold leads. The other park visitors had grown accustomed to seeing her there. The elderly woman who spent her mornings quietly working with what appeared to be costume jewelry or antique trinkets. Margaret's own military family background had taught her that service members were never truly gone as long as someone remembered their sacrifice, honored their memory, and refused to let their stories disappear into bureaucratic obscurity. Her father had told her stories about Chinese resistance fighters who had died helping American forces, men whose names were never recorded in official histories, but whose contributions had been essential to Allied victory. Her mother had spoken about the importance of preserving memory, of ensuring that individual acts of courage were not lost in the vast scope of historical events. The morning joggers, dog walkers, and park maintenance workers had no idea that the quiet woman on the Kolga bench was conducting her own private memorial service, her own effort to ensure that these 17 missing servicemen would not be forgotten. Margaret had no military training, no official authority, and no resources beyond her government pension and her own determination. But she had something that bureaucracies often lacked: the patience to care about individual stories, the persistence to pursue cold leads, and the deep belief that every person who had died in service to their country deserved to be remembered by name. Colonel Harrison had been jogging through Meridian Park for 6 months before he finally decided to approach the elderly woman he had seen every Wednesday morning. Something about her careful attention to the items in her wooden box had caught his eye, and as a retired Air Force officer, he had developed an instinct for recognizing military memorabilia. When he stopped to examine the Distinguished Flying Cross in Margaret's hands, he had expected to see a family heirloom, perhaps a grandfather's medal being preserved by a devoted descendant. Instead, he found himself staring at a piece of history that he had never expected to see again. Margaret had made her promise to Robert on a cold February morning in 1969, standing beside his empty grave at Arlington National Cemetery. The military funeral had been conducted with full honors, complete with a 21-gun salute, the folding of the flag, and the presentation of his Purple Heart and Bronze Star to Margaret as his widow. But the casket had been empty, containing Only soil from the Vietnamese hillside where his helicopter had crashed. And Margaret had understood with devastating clarity that Robert's body would never come home. After the ceremony, when the other mourners had departed and the cemetery had grown quiet, Margaret had remained beside the marble headstone that bore her husband's name, dates of birth and death, and the simple inscription, "Beloved husband, faithful servant." She had knelt in the winter grass, placed her hand on the cold stone, and spoken aloud the words that would shape the rest of her life. "I promise you, Robert, that I will never let any of them be forgotten. Not you, not any of them who disappeared. Fighting for this country. Someone needs to remember their names, their faces, their stories. Someone needs to make sure they come home, even if it's just their memory coming home." That promise had sustained Margaret through 42 years of government service, through the endless bureaucracy of military records, through the frustration of classified files that couldn't be shared with grieving families, and through the slow realization that the Department of Defense, for all its vast resources and good intentions, simply couldn't provide personal attention to every individual case of missing servicemen. The military machine was designed to process thousands of personnel actions efficiently, but it wasn't structured to spend years tracking down a single medal, researching a single family, or ensuring that one missing pilot's story would be preserved. For future generations, Margaret's commitment had evolved and deepened during her decades of work at Travis Air Force Base. She had encountered hundreds of cases involving personnel who had died in classified operations, whose families had been told only the most basic information about their loved ones' final missions. She had processed files for pilots who had vanished during reconnaissance flights over the Soviet Union, for Special Forces operators who had died in countries where the United States officially had no military presence, and for sailors who had been lost during submarine missions that remained classified decades after the end of the Cold War. Each case had reinforced Margaret's understanding that military families often received only partial closure, that the demands of national security sometimes prevented the Pentagon from sharing information that might help families understand how their loved ones had died. She had seen mothers die without ever learning the specific circumstances of their sons' deaths, fathers who had spent decades wondering whether their missing children might still be alive in some foreign prison, and siblings who had been told only that their brothers had died heroically while serving their country. The wooden box containing the 17 medals had become Margaret's physical manifestation of her promise to Robert. Each medal represented not just a missing serviceman, but a family who had been left with questions, a story that had been partially classified, and a person whose sacrifice deserved to be remembered in specific personal detail rather than simply acknowledged as part of abstract military statistics. Margaret had committed herself to researching each case with the same thoroughness she had once applied to official personnel files, but with the added dimension of emotional investment that government bureaucracy couldn't provide. Her research methodology had been developed over 15 years of persistent investigation. For each medal, Margaret would begin by documenting every detail she could observe: the type of medal, any unit designations, serial numbers, and the condition of the presentation case. She would photograph each item from multiple angles, creating a comprehensive visual record that could be shared with military historians, veteran organizations, and family members. She would then research the specific medal type, learning about the criteria for its award, the typical circumstances under which it was presented, and the historical context of the conflicts during which it might have been earned. The next phase of Margaret's research involved accessing public records through the National Archives, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and various military historical societies. She had learned to navigate the complex system of declassified documents, casualty reports, and unit histories that were available to civilian researchers. She had developed relationships with librarians at military installations, historians at veteran organizations, and volunteers at genealogical societies who could help her locate surviving family members and piece together the personal stories behind each medal. Margaret's most challenging and emotionally demanding work involved contacting surviving family members when she could locate them, to inform them that their loved one's medal had been found, and to gather additional information about the missing serviceman's life and military service. These conversations required extraordinary sensitivity, as Margaret often found herself speaking with elderly parents, siblings, or spouses who had spent decades wondering about their loved one's fate. Many families had never received their loved one's medals, having been told that the awards had been lost or destroyed in various administrative transitions. Some of Margaret's most meaningful successes had involved reuniting families with medals they had never known existed. She had located the daughter of a Navy corpsman who had died on Iwo Jima, presenting her with her father's Purple Heart and a folder of research documenting his final battle. She had found the younger brother of an Army Air Forces pilot who had been shot down over Germany, providing him with his brother's air medal and copies of mission reports that described his courage during bombing runs over Nazi-occupied territory. She had contacted the widow of a Marine who had died during the Korean War, given her his Bronze Star and a collection of letters from his fellow Marines describing his leadership under fire. But Margaret's research had also revealed the limitations of civilian investigation into military matters. Many of the cases represented by medals in her wooden box involved classified operations, sensitive intelligence missions, or experimental programs that remained protected by national security considerations. She had encountered files that had been permanently sealed, casualty reports that had been heavily redacted, and military personnel who were still bound by security oaths that prevented them from discussing specific operations or missions. Case of Captain James Mitchell had become Margaret's most challenging and personal investigation. The Navy pilot's disappearance in 1957 had occurred during the height of the Cold War, when American reconnaissance missions over the Pacific were among the most sensitive operations conducted by the U.S. military. The official reports described a routine training flight that had ended in mechanical failure, but Margaret's research had uncovered inconsistencies in the timeline, unusual security protocols that had been applied to the case, and references to classified mission parameters that suggested Mitchell's final flight had been far more significant than a simple training exercise. Margaret had spent 3 years attempting to locate Captain Mitchell's surviving family members, following leads that had taken her through military databases, civilian genealogical records, and Social Security death indices. She had discovered that Mitchell's parents had both died in the 1990s, but that his younger sister Patricia was still alive and living somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. Every attempt to make contact had failed, leading Margaret to wonder whether Patricia Mitchell had intentionally isolated herself from any reminders of her brother's military service, or whether she had simply moved beyond the reach of conventional research methods. The distinguished flying cross that belonged to Captain Mitchell had become the centerpiece of Margaret's Wednesday morning ritual at Meridian Park. She would hold the medal in her hands, polishing its bronze surface until it gleamed, studying the eagle and shield emblem, and reading the citation that described Mitchell's exceptional service during the Korean War. The medal represented not just an individual act of courage, but a family's incomplete mourning, a story that had been classified beyond the reach of civilian investigation, and a promise that Margaret had made to ensure that no serviceman would be forgotten. The phone call came on a Thursday morning in October, interrupting Margaret's careful indexing of recently declassified Korean War documents she had requested from the National Archives. The voice on the other end was professionally courteous but unmistakably authoritative, identifying himself as Special Agent David Morrison from the Defense Security Service, and requesting that Margaret meet with him the following morning to discuss her recent research activities involving classified military personnel files. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she held the telephone receiver, understanding immediately that her 15 years of private investigation had finally attracted the attention of the same government agencies that had originally classified many of the cases she had been researching. Agent Morrison's tone was polite but firm, making it clear that this was not a request she could decline, and that her research into Captain James Mitchell's disappearance had triggered security protocols that required immediate clarification. After hanging up the phone, Margaret sat in her small apartment kitchen, staring at the wooden box containing the 17 medals, and realizing that her promise to Robert might have led her into territory that the government considered too sensitive for civilian investigation. She had always known that some of the cases she researched involved classified operations, but she had assumed that her work with publicly available documents and her decades of security clearance at Cade Travis Air Force Base would protect her from any serious scrutiny. The meeting with Agent Morrison took place at a federal building in downtown Sacramento, in a sterile conference room that reminded Margaret of countless briefings she had attended during her career as a government contractor. Morrison was a man in his 40s, wearing a conservative business suit and carrying a thick file folder that Margaret suspected contained detailed information about her research activities, her contacts with military historians, and her attempts to locate surviving family members of missing servicemen. Morrison explained that the Defense Security Service had been monitoring Margaret's Freedom of Information Act requests, her contacts with military archives, and her research into several cases involving personnel who had died during classified operations. He stated that while Margaret's intentions were clearly honorable, her investigation into Captain Mitchell's disappearance had touched on information that remained classified at the highest levels of government security, and that her continued research could potentially compromise ongoing intelligence operations or reveal information that could endanger national security. The agent presented Margaret with a detailed summary of her research activities, demonstrating that government agencies had been tracking her work far more closely than she had ever imagined. They knew about her visits to military libraries, her correspondence with veteran organizations, her attempts to contact surviving family members, and her collection of medals that represented cases involving classified operations. Morrison emphasized that Margaret was not suspected of any wrongdoing, but that her research had inadvertently approached information that the government needed to protect. Morrison then presented Margaret with what he described as a voluntary agreement that would allow her to continue her research into most of the cases represented by medals in her wooden box, but would require her to cease all investigation into Captain Mitchell's disappearance and surrender any documents or information she had gathered about his final mission. The agreement would also require Margaret to submit all future research plans to the Defense Security Service for review, ensuring that her work would not inadvertently compromise classified information. Margaret realized that she was facing and realized that she was facing and compromised classified information. Margaret realized that she was facing, ensuring that her work would not inadvertently that she was facing an impossible choice between her personal mission to honor missing servicemen and the demand that she abandon her most significant case. Captain Mitchell's Distinguished Flying Cross had become the centerpiece of her research, representing not just one missing pilot, but the broader pattern of classified operations that had left families without answers about their loved one's fate. Accepting the government's restrictions would mean breaking her promise to Robert, abandoning Patricia Mitchell's right to learn the truth about her brother's disappearance, and acknowledging that some military families would never receive the closure they deserved. The agent explained that Margaret's research into Captain Mitchell's case had been particularly concerning because it had led her to contact several retired military personnel who had been involved in classified Pacific reconnaissance operations during the 1950s. Her letters to these veterans had raised questions about whether Mitchell's disappearance had been connected to broader intelligence activities. and whether his final mission had involved sensitive operations that could still affect current national security interests. Morrison emphasized that the government's concern was not with Margaret's dedication to honoring missing servicemen, but with the possibility that her investigation could reveal information about intelligence operations that had been classified for over 60 years. He explained that some Cold War missions remained sensitive because they involved intelligence-gathering techniques, foreign relationships, or operational methods that could still be relevant to current national security challenges. Margaret understood that her choice would affect not just her own research, but potentially the broader community of families who were still seeking information about missing servicemen. If she accepted the government's restrictions, she would be acknowledging that civilian researchers had no right to investigate classified aspects of military history, even when that investigation was motivated by a desire to provide closure to grieving families. The meeting concluded with Morrison giving Margaret 1 week to consider the voluntary agreement, emphasizing that her cooperation would be appreciated, but that the government had other options for protecting classified information if she chose not to comply. He left Margaret with the clear understanding that continuing her research into Captain Mitchell's case could result in serious legal consequences, including potential charges related to unauthorized investigation of classified information. Margaret returned to her apartment that afternoon carrying the weight of a decision that would determine whether she could fulfill her promise to Robert or would be forced to abandon the most important case she had ever researched. The wooden box containing the 17 medals sat on her kitchen table, but Captain Mitchell's distinguished flying cross seemed to carry additional significance now that the government had confirmed her suspicions about the classified nature of his final mission. That evening, Margaret called her nephew David, her only remaining family member, to discuss the situation without revealing the specific details of her meeting with Agent Morrison. David had always been supportive of Margaret's research, understanding that her work with missing servicemen's medals was her way of honoring Robert's memory and maintaining her connection to the military community that had shaped her entire adult life. David listened carefully as Margaret explained that she had encountered government resistance to her research and that she might be forced to abandon her investigation into several cases involving classified operations. He reminded Margaret that she had already accomplished remarkable work in reuniting families with their loved ones' medals, and that her safety and legal security were more important than any individual case, regardless of how compelling the mystery might be. But Margaret understood that accepting the government's restrictions would mean abandoning not just Captain Mitchell's case, but the broader principle that military families deserve to know the truth about their loved ones. Sacrifice. She had spent 15 years building relationships with veteran organizations, military historians, and surviving family members who trusted her to pursue cases that official channels had been unable or unwilling to investigate. Margaret faced a choice that would define the remainder of her life. She could accept the government's restrictions and continue her work within officially approved boundaries, or she could refuse to abandon Captain Mitchell's case and risk losing her ability to help any of the families who were still seeking answers about their missing loved ones. Margaret spent the entire weekend walking through the neighborhoods of Sacramento, carrying Captain Mitchell's distinguished flying cross in her coat pocket, feeling the weight of the medal against her chest as she tried to imagine what Patricia Mitchell's life had been like for the past 67 years. She pictured a young woman who had lost her older brother when she was barely 20 years old, who had been told that James had died serving his country, but who had never received the full story of his disappearance or the recognition of his exceptional service that was represented by the medal in Margaret's possession. The decision that Margaret faced was not simply about complying with government restrictions or continuing her research into one specific case. It was about the fundamental question of whether individuals had the right to seek truth about their family members' military service, even when that truth had been classified by agencies that claimed to be protecting national security. Margaret understood that her choice would establish a precedent for how she would handle similar situations in the future, and whether she would allow government pressure to override her commitment to the families who were still seeking closure. Sunday morning found Margaret sitting in the small Catholic church where she had attended Mass every week for the past 20 years, holding Captain Mitchell's medal in her hands during the quiet moments before the service began. The morning light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the pews, and Margaret found herself remembering the military chaplain who had conducted Robert's funeral service in 1969. The chaplain had spoken about sacrifice, about the cost of freedom, and about the responsibility that survivors carried to ensure that those who had died in service to their country would never be forgotten. Margaret realized that her decision would not only affect her own research, but would also determine whether she could continue to serve as an advocate for military families who had been left with incomplete information about their loved one's fate. Over the past 15 years, she had become known within the community of veteran organizations and military historians as someone who would pursue cases that others had abandoned, who would spend months or years tracking down leads that seemed impossible, and who would never give up on finding answers for families who had been waiting decades for closure. The voluntary agreement that Agent Morrison had presented to Margaret would effectively end her ability to investigate the most challenging and meaningful cases, the ones involving classified operations where families had been told only the most basic information about their loved one's disappearance. These were precisely the cases where Margaret's persistence and dedication were most needed, where official channels had been unable to provide the personal attention and long-term commitment that was required to locate missing medals, research complex histories, and reunite families with tangible connections to their loved ones. Margaret understood that accepting the government's restrictions would mean acknowledging that some families would never receive the closure they deserved, that some missing servicemen would remain forgotten, and that the promise she had made to Robert would be broken. But she also understood that refusing to comply could result in her losing the ability to help any families, could expose her to serious legal consequences, and could potentially endanger the safety of people who had trusted her with sensitive information. On Monday morning, Margaret returned to Meridian Park with her wooden box of medals, choosing her usual bench and beginning her ritual of polishing each piece with careful attention. The morning joggers and dog walkers passed by without acknowledgement, unaware that the elderly woman they had seen every Wednesday for months was facing a decision that would determine whether she could continue her mission of honoring missing servicemen or would be forced to abandon the most important case she had ever encountered. As Margaret held Captain Mitchell's Distinguished Flying Cross in her hands, she found herself thinking about the citation that described his exceptional courage during combat missions over North Korea, his innovative approaches to aerial reconnaissance, and his unwavering commitment to gathering intelligence that had saved the lives of countless ground forces. The medal represented not just Mitchell's individual heroism, but the broader pattern of classified operations that had required servicemen to risk their lives in missions that could never be publicly acknowledged or fully explained to their families. Margaret realized that her research into Captain Mitchell's case had been motivated by more than simple curiosity about one missing pilot. She had been pursuing a broader understanding of how the demands of national security had affected military families, how classification policies had prevented families from receiving complete information about their loved one's service, and how the individual stories of missing servicemen had been subsumed into abstract discussions of intelligence operations and Cold War strategy. The Distinguished Flying Cross in Margaret's hands represented the tangible connection between Captain Mitchell's classified final mission and his family's right to understand his sacrifice. Patricia Mitchell had lived her entire adult life without knowing that her brother had been awarded this medal, without understanding the full scope of his military service, and without receiving the recognition that his exceptional courage had earned from the highest levels of the U.S. Navy. Margaret's decision would determine whether Patricia Mitchell would ever learn about her brother's distinguished flying cross, whether she would ever receive the medal that rightfully belonged to her as his only surviving family member, and whether she would ever have the opportunity to understand the full story of James Mitchell's military service and heroic death. The government's restrictions would ensure that this information remained classified, that Patricia would never receive her brother's medal, and that Captain Mitchell's story would remain buried in files that were sealed beyond the reach of civilian investigation. By Tuesday afternoon, Margaret had made her choice. She would not sign the voluntary agreement that Agent Morrison had presented to her. She would not abandon her research into Captain Mitchell's case, and she would not accept the government's assertion that national security considerations outweighed Patricia Mitchell's right to learn the truth about her brother's disappearance and to receive the medal that honored his exceptional service. Margaret understood that this decision would likely result in serious legal consequences for her personally, but she also understood that some principles were more important than personal safety. Her promise to Robert had been unconditional, and her commitment to ensuring that no serviceman would be forgotten extended to cases involving classified operations, as well as those that had been declassified. The fact that Captain Mitchell's final mission had been classified did not diminish his right to be remembered, his family's right to know the truth about his sacrifice, or Margaret's responsibility to ensure that his story would not disappear into bureaucratic obscurity. Margaret called Agent Morrison on Wednesday morning, informing him that she would not sign the voluntary agreement and that she intended to continue her research into Captain Mitchell's case. Morrison's response was professional but firm, warning Margaret that her decision would likely result in legal action and that the government had various methods for protecting classified information from unauthorized investigation. Margaret understood that she was now facing a confrontation with the same government agencies that had originally classified Captain Mitchell's disappearance, and that her resources for fighting this battle were limited to her own determination, her knowledge of military bureaucracy, and her connections within the community of veteran organizations and military historians who had supported her research over the past 15 years. The choice had been made, and Margaret would now face the consequences of refusing to abandon her most important case. Within 48 hours of Margaret's phone call to Agent Morrison, the consequences of her decision began manifesting in ways that demonstrated the government's extensive reach into civilian life. The Sacramento Public Library informed Margaret that her research privileges had been suspended pending a review of her activities, effectively cutting off her access to the computer terminals and databases she had used for years to investigate missing servicemen cases. The librarian who delivered this news, Mrs. Patterson, had worked with Margaret for over a decade and was visibly uncomfortable explaining that the suspension had come from federal authorities who had not provided specific details about the nature of the security concerns. Margaret's longtime contacts at the National Archives suddenly stopped responding to her correspondence, and several Freedom of Information Act requests that had been pending for months were officially denied with citations of national security exemptions that had not been invoked in her previous interactions with these agencies. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a military historian at the Hoover Institution who had collaborated with Margaret on several cases, called to inform her that she had been instructed by her supervisors to cease all communication with Margaret and to forward any future inquiries to the Defense Security Service. The isolation was swift and comprehensive, designed to demonstrate to Margaret that her research network could be dismantled as easily as it had been built. Veterans organizations that had previously welcomed her inquiries and provided assistance with her investigations began declining her requests for information, explaining that they had received guidance from federal agencies about the sensitivity of certain historical cases and the importance of channeling all research through official military channels. Margaret discovered that her home telephone was experiencing unusual interference, with clicks and static that had never been present. Before her conversation with Agent Morrison, her mail delivery became erratic, with some letters arriving weeks after their postmark dates and others apparently never reaching their intended destinations. When she attempted to contact Patricia Mitchell directly through directory assistance, she was told that no such person could be located in Portland, Oregon, despite her previous research indicating that Patricia was living in that area. The psychological pressure was subtle but constant, designed to make Margaret understand that continuing her research into Captain Mitchell's case would result in complete isolation from the academic and military communities that had supported her work for 15 years. The government's message was clear. Margaret could continue her research within approved boundaries, but any attempt to investigate classified cases would result in the systematic dismantling of her ability to help any family seeking information about their missing loved ones. Margaret's nephew David began receiving phone calls from people who identified themselves as government security personnel, asking questions about Margaret's research activities, her mental health, and her potential access to classified information. The calls were professionally conducted, but clearly designed to create the impression that Margaret was under investigation for potentially serious security violations. David contacted Margaret to express his concern about these inquiries and to urge her to reconsider her decision to refuse the government's voluntary agreement. The veteran community in Sacramento began to react with a mixture of support and concern. As word spread about Margaret's confrontation with federal authorities, some veterans who had worked with Margaret on previous cases expressed admiration for her courage in standing up to government pressure, understanding that her research had provided closure to families who had been waiting decades for information about their missing loved ones. These veterans recognized that Margaret's work represented a form of advocacy that was essential for military families who lacked the resources or connections to pursue their own investigations. But other veterans expressed concern that Margaret's defiance of government security protocols could damage the broader veteran community's relationship with federal agencies, potentially making it more difficult for legitimate veteran organizations to access the cooperation and resources they needed to serve their members. Some argued that Margaret's individual case was not worth risking the comprehensive support that the government provided to veteran programs, and that her continued research into classified cases could result in restrictions that would affect all civilian researchers working on military history. Margaret received a registered letter from the Defense Security Service, formally notifying her that her research activities had been classified as a potential security risk, and that any further investigation into cases involving classified operations would be considered a violation of federal law. The letter detailed specific penalties that could be imposed for unauthorized investigation of classified information, including substantial fines and potential imprisonment. The document also informed Margaret that her activities were being monitored and that any attempt to share classified information with unauthorized persons would result in immediate legal action. The letter included a detailed inventory of Margaret's research activities, demonstrating that government agencies had been tracking her work far more extensively than she had previously understood. They had documented her correspondence with military historians, her contacts with surviving family members, her visits to military libraries, and her attempts to locate Patricia Mitchell. The government's comprehensive surveillance of her activities made it clear that they possessed the resources to monitor and restrict her research indefinitely. Margaret's local church community began to reflect the broader divisions within the veteran community, with some parishioners expressing support for her principled stand against government overreach, while others questioned whether her confrontation with federal authorities was worth the potential consequences. Father Rodriguez, who had served as a military chaplain before entering parish ministry, attempted to provide spiritual guidance to Margaret while acknowledging that her situation involved complex questions about the relationship between individual conscience and government authority. The emotional toll of the isolation began to affect Margaret's daily routine and mental health. She continued her weekly visits to Meridian Park, but the ritual of polishing the metals had become a solitary act of defiance rather than a peaceful form of remembrance. She found herself looking over her shoulder during her walks, wondering whether government agents were monitoring her activities, and questioning whether her continued research was putting other people at risk. Margaret's attempt to contact retired Navy personnel who had served with Captain Mitchell resulted in several uncomfortable conversations with family members who informed her that their relatives had been instructed not to discuss any matters related to Pacific reconnaissance operations during the 1950s. One widow explained that her late husband had been contacted by Defense Security Service agents and had been reminded of his ongoing obligations under security oaths he had signed over 60 years ago. The systematic dismantling of Margaret's research network extended to her relationships with genealogical researchers and civilian historians who had previously assisted her in locating surviving family members. Several of these contacts informed Margaret that they had been advised to cease all collaboration with her and to report any future communications to appropriate authorities. The message was clear. Margaret's research into Captain Mitchell's case was now considered a matter of national security, and anyone who assisted her investigation would be subject to similar scrutiny. Margaret realized that the government's response to her defiance had been carefully calculated to demonstrate that she was powerless to continue her research without official approval. The systematic isolation was designed to force her to reconsider her decision and accept the voluntary agreement that would allow her to continue her work within approved boundaries while abandoning her investigation into the most challenging and meaningful cases. But Margaret also understood that yielding to this pressure would mean abandoning her promise to Robert, accepting that some military families would never receive the closure they deserved, and acknowledging that individual citizens had no right to seek truth about their government's actions, even when that truth involved honoring the sacrifice of missing servicemen. The consequences of her decision had become clear, but Margaret remained determined to continue her research into Captain Mitchell's case, regardless of the personal cost. The first sign that Margaret's isolation had not gone unnoticed came from an unexpected source. Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez, who had retired from the Air Force in 2019 after 30 years of service, had been quietly observing Margaret's weekly ritual at Meridian Park for the past 4 months. As a former military intelligence analyst, Vasquez had developed an instinct for recognizing when someone was conducting serious research, and she had become increasingly curious about the elderly woman who treated a collection of military medals with such obvious reverence and professional attention. Vasquez had initially assumed that Margaret was a military widow or mother who was preserving family heirlooms, but her trained eye had noticed details that suggested something more complex. The medals in Margaret's wooden box represented different time periods, various branches of service, and types of awards that were unlikely to belong to a single family. More significantly, Margaret's handling of the medals demonstrated a level of knowledge about military decorations that suggested professional familiarity with military personnel systems. When Vasquez noticed that Margaret had missed her regular Wednesday morning appearance at the park for 2 consecutive weeks, she decided to investigate further. Her inquiries within the local veteran community revealed that Margaret Chen had been conducting private research into missing servicemen for over 15 years, and that her work had recently attracted the attention of federal security agencies. The story that emerged painted a picture of a woman who had dedicated her retirement to honoring fallen servicemen, but who was now facing government pressure to abandon her most important case. Vasquez immediately recognized the implications of Margaret's situation. As a former intelligence analyst, she understood that the government's response to Margaret's research suggested that Captain Mitchell's disappearance had involved classified operations that remained sensitive after 67 years. But she also understood that Margaret's 15 years of successful research had provided closure to dozens of military families who had been waiting decades for information about their missing loved ones. The veteran community in Sacramento began to mobilize around Margaret's case through informal networks that had been built over decades of mutual support and shared service. Vasquez contacted Colonel James Patterson, a retired Air Force officer who had served as the regional representative for several veteran organizations, explaining Margaret's situation and requesting his assistance in understanding the broader implications of the government's actions. Patterson had encountered similar cases during his military career, situations where classification policies had prevented families from receiving complete information about their loved ones' service or sacrifice. Patterson's investigation revealed that Margaret's confrontation with the Defense Security Service had become a topic of discussion within veteran organizations throughout California. Many veterans recognized that Margaret's research represented a form of advocacy that was essential for military families who lacked the resources or connections to pursue their own investigations into missing servicemen. The systematic dismantling of Margaret's research network was seen as a threat to the broader principle that military families deserve to know the truth about their loved one's service. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a retired Navy psychiatrist who had specialized in treating veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, learned about Margaret's case through her connections with veteran support groups in the Sacramento area. Dr. Mitchell had spent her career working with military families who had been affected by the loss of loved ones in combat operations, and she understood the psychological importance of closure for surviving family members. She recognized that Margaret's research provided a form of healing that was not available through official military channels. The case attracted the attention of investigative journalist Robert Kim, who had covered military affairs for the Sacramento Bee for over 20 years. Kim had previously written about the challenges faced by military families seeking information about missing servicemen, and he understood that Margaret's situation represented a broader pattern of government secrecy that affected thousands of families across the country. His preliminary research into Captain Mitchell's disappearance revealed inconsistencies in the official records that suggested the Navy pilot's final mission had been far more significant than a routine training flight. Kim's investigation led him to contact retired Navy Commander Frank Torres, who had served as a naval aviation officer during the 1950s and had personal knowledge of the Pacific reconnaissance operations that had been conducted during the height of the Cold War. Torres confirmed that many missions during that period had been classified at the highest levels of government security, and that the families of personnel who had died during these operations had often been told only the most basic information about their loved ones' disappearance. Torres explained that classification of Cold War reconnaissance missions had been designed to protect intelligence-gathering techniques and operational methods that could be compromised if enemy forces learned about American capabilities. But he also acknowledged that the long-term classification of these missions had prevented military families from receiving the recognition and closure that they deserved, and that many heroes of the Cold War had been forgotten because their service could not be publicly acknowledged. The networking within the veteran community began to reveal the scope of Margaret's impact over the past 15 years. Veterans organizations across California had records of cases where Margaret had successfully reunited families with their loved ones' medals, providing closure to widows who had never received their husbands' awards, children who had never known about their father's military decorations, and siblings who had been searching for information about their brother's service. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, who had served as a military liaison officer during her Air Force career, had worked with Margaret on several cases involving Air Force personnel who had died during classified operations. Santos understood that Margaret's research had been conducted with the highest levels of professional integrity, and that her work had never compromised operational security or endangered active military operations. She recognized that Margaret's confrontation with federal authorities was based on her investigation into historical cases that posed no current security threat. Santos began contacting retired military personnel who had benefited from Margaret's research, explaining the situation and requesting their support for her continued work. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with dozens of veterans expressing their willingness to assist Margaret in whatever way possible. Many of these veterans had personal experience with the bureaucratic challenges involved in obtaining information about missing servicemen, and they understood that Margaret's persistence and dedication had been essential for providing closure. To families who had been waiting decades for answers, the mobilization of support for Margaret revealed the extent to which her work had touched the lives of people throughout the military community. Retired officers who had served in different conflicts and different branches of service recognized that Margaret's research represented a form of service that was as important as their own military careers. Her commitment to ensuring that no serviceman would be forgotten had created a network of relationships that extended far beyond the local Sacramento veteran community. The growing awareness of Margaret's situation began to attract the attention of veteran organizations at the national level. The Veterans of Foreign Wars, the American Legion, and other major veteran organizations had members who had been following Margaret's case, and they began to discuss the broader implications of the government's actions. These organizations understood that Margaret's research had been conducted within the bounds of civilian rights and legal research methods, and that her confrontation with federal authorities represented a threat to the principle that military families deserved to know the truth about their loved ones. Service. The community awakening around Margaret's case was beginning to build momentum that would soon challenge the government's attempt to silence her research and abandon her investigation into Captain Mitchell's disappearance. The veteran community had recognized that Margaret's work represented their own values and commitments, and they were preparing to stand with her against federal pressure. The transformation of individual concern into organized action began when Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez convened a meeting at the Sacramento Veterans Community Center on a Thursday evening in November. The invitation had been extended through informal networks that connected retired military personnel throughout Northern California, and the response exceeded all expectations. Over 60 veterans representing every branch of service and spanning conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan gathered in the community center's main hall, united by their shared recognition that Margaret Chen's confrontation with federal authorities represented a threat to principles that transcended any individual case. Colonel James Patterson opened the meeting by presenting a comprehensive briefing on Margaret's situation, explaining her 15 years of research into missing servicemen, her success in reuniting families with their loved ones' medals, and the government's systematic dismantling of her research network following her refusal to abandon the Captain Mitchell case. Patterson's presentation demonstrated that Margaret's work had provided closure to over 40 military families, returning medals and information that had been lost or misplaced through decades of bureaucratic transitions and administrative oversights. Veterans in attendance recognized immediately that Margaret's research represented the kind of individual initiative and personal commitment that military culture valued above all else. Her willingness to spend her own resources, invest her own time, and risk her personal safety to ensure that missing servicemen would not be forgotten embodied the military values of loyalty, duty, and service before self that had shaped their own careers and continued to guide their civilian lives. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos presented a detailed analysis of the legal and procedural issues surrounding Margaret's case, explaining that her research had been conducted entirely within the bounds of civilian rights and established procedures for accessing declassified military information. Santos demonstrated that Margaret's investigation into Captain Mitchell's disappearance had not involved any attempt to access currently classified information, but had focused on historical records that should have been available to civilian researchers under normal circumstances. The veterans understood that the Government's response to Margaret's research had been disproportionate to any actual security threat, and that the systematic isolation of her research network suggested that federal agencies were more concerned with preventing embarrassing revelations about Cold War operations than with protecting legitimate national security interests. Many of the veterans had personal experience with classification policies that seemed designed more to protect institutions from scrutiny than to safeguard operational security. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the retired Navy psychiatrist, addressed the press the psychological impact of Margaret's research on military families, explaining that the closure provided by recovering missing servicemen's medals and learning about their final missions was essential for the healing process that followed military loss. She emphasized that Margaret's work had provided a form of therapy that was not available through official military channels, and that her research had helped dozens of families move through their grief and find peace with their loved one's sacrifice. The meeting's focus shifted to developing a comprehensive strategy for supporting Margaret's continued research and challenging the government's attempt to silence her investigation. The veterans recognized that they possessed resources and connections that could be mobilized to counteract the systematic isolation that federal agencies had imposed on Margaret's work. Their collective experience included expertise in military law, intelligence operations, media relations, and political advocacy that could be brought to bear on her behalf. Retired Air Force Colonel David Martinez, who had served as a congressional liaison officer during his military career, proposed a multi-pronged approach that would combine legal challenges, media pressure, and political advocacy to support Margaret's research. Martinez explained that several members of Congress had previously expressed concern about excessive government secrecy and its impact on military families, and that Margaret's case could serve as a compelling example of how classification policies sometimes prevented families from receiving the closure they deserved. The legal strategy was developed by retired Army Judge Advocate General Officer Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Walsh, who had specialized in military law and had extensive experience with classification issues during her military career. Walsh proposed challenging the government's restrictions on Margaret's research through a combination of Freedom of Information Act litigation and constitutional arguments about the right of families to learn about their loved ones' military service. She explained that the government's systematic dismantling of Margaret's research network could be challenged as an abuse of federal power that exceeded the legitimate scope of national security. Classification. The media strategy was coordinated by retired Navy Commander Frank Torres and investigative journalist Robert Kim, who proposed a comprehensive campaign to educate the public about Margaret's work and the government's response to her research. Torres explained that public awareness of Margaret's situation could generate political pressure that would force federal agencies to justify their actions and potentially reverse their restrictions on her research. Kim committed to writing a series of articles that would document Margaret's 15 years of successful research and contrast her achievements with the government's attempt to silence her investigation. The veterans' mobilization included establishing a legal defense fund to support Margaret's court challenges, creating a media campaign to raise public awareness of her situation, and developing a network of contacts within Congress and the Pentagon who could advocate for her continued research. The collective resources of the veteran community were being organized to support one individual whose commitment to honoring missing servicemen had embodied their own values and principles. Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez proposed the most ambitious element of the support strategy, a coordinated effort to locate Patricia Mitchell and ensure that she would receive her brother's Distinguished Flying Cross, regardless of the government's restrictions on Margaret's research. Vasquez explained that the veteran community possessed investigative resources and connections that could be mobilized to find Patricia Mitchell and provide her with the information about her brother's service that she had been denied for 67 years. The search for Patricia Mitchell was organized as a military operation with retired intelligence analysts, military police investigators, and administrative specialists contributing their expertise to the effort. Retired Air Force Master Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, who had specialized in personnel location during his military career, developed a comprehensive search strategy that would utilize both official databases and informal networks to locate Patricia Mitchell and establish contact with her. The veteran's commitment to supporting Margaret's research extended beyond the immediate legal and media challenges. They recognized that her confrontation with federal authorities represented a broader principle about the relationship between military families and government secrecy, and that the outcome of her case would affect the ability of other civilian researchers to investigate missing servicemen cases in the future. The mobilization of veteran support for Margaret's research began to attract attention from military families throughout California and beyond. Word of the veterans meeting and their commitment to supporting Margaret's work spread through informal networks that connected military communities across the country. Families who had been searching for information about their own missing loved ones began contacting the Sacramento veterans, requesting assistance with their own cases and expressing support for Margaret's continued research. The veteran community's response to Margaret's situation demonstrated the power of military values and bonds that transcended individual service careers. The collective commitment to ensuring that no serviceman would be forgotten had mobilized resources and expertise that rivaled the government agencies that were attempting to silence Margaret's research. The veterans were preparing to challenge federal authority with the same determination and courage that had characterized their military service. The organized support for Margaret's research was building toward a confrontation that would determine whether individual citizens had the right to seek truth about their government's actions, even when that truth involved honoring the sacrifice of missing servicemen who had died in classified operations. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in December when retired Air Force Master Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez received a phone call from a genealogical researcher in Portland, Oregon, who had been working through veteran networks to locate Patricia Mitchell. The researcher, Susan Davis, had discovered that Patricia Mitchell had been living under her married name, Patricia Mitchell-Brennan, in a small assisted living facility in Beaverton, Oregon, just outside Portland. She was 84 years old, had been widowed for 12 years, and had no children, making her Captain James Mitchell's only surviving family member. Rodriguez immediately contacted the coordination team that had been organized by the Sacramento veterans, and within hours, retired Navy Commander Frank Torres was driving north on Interstate 5 toward Oregon, carrying Captain Mitchell's distinguished flying cross and a comprehensive folder of research that Margaret Chen had compiled over 3 years of investigation. Torres had volunteered for this mission because of his personal knowledge of Cold War naval aviation operations, and because he understood the historical significance of the medal and the story that needed to be told to Patricia Mitchell. The assisted living facility in Beaverton was a modest, well-maintained building that housed approximately 60 residents, most of whom were elderly veterans or their surviving spouses. The staff at Sunset Manor had been expecting Torres' visit, having been contacted by the facility's administrator, who was himself a retired Army colonel and had immediately understood the importance of the mission when Torres had explained the situation over the phone. Patricia Mitchell-Brennan was a small, dignified woman who still maintained the posture and bearing that suggested a lifetime of quiet strength and resilience. Her apartment was decorated with photographs spanning 8 decades of family history. But Torres noticed immediately that there were no military photographs or memorabilia visible, suggesting that Patricia had chosen to minimize reminders of her brother's military service and disappearance. When Torres introduced himself and explained the purpose of his visit, Patricia's initial reaction was one of cautious skepticism, tempered by curiosity about why anyone would be interested in her brother's story after so many years. Torres began by showing Patricia the Distinguished Flying Cross, explaining that it had been awarded to her brother for his exceptional courage and skill during combat missions over North Korea, years before his disappearance in 1957. Patricia held the medal in her hands for the first time, reading the citation that described James Mitchell's heroic service, and tears began to form in her eyes as she realized that her brother had been officially recognized for achievements that she had never known existed. Patricia explained that her family had been told very little about James' military service, and that his disappearance had been described only as a training accident that had occurred during a routine flight over the Pacific Ocean. She had never been informed that he had been awarded any medals, had never received any recognition of his service beyond the basic notification of his death, and had spent 67 years believing that her brother had died in an unremarkable accident, rather than as a decorated combat veteran. Torres presented Patricia with Margaret Chen's research folder, which contained copies of declassified mission reports documenting James Mitchell's combat service in Korea, photographs of his squadron, and testimonials from fellow pilots who had described his exceptional skill and courage during some of the most dangerous reconnaissance missions of the Korean War. Patricia studied each document carefully, learning for the first time about her brother's distinguished military career and the high regard in which he had been held by his fellow naval aviators. The emotional impact of learning about her brother's true military service was overwhelming for Patricia, who had spent her entire adult life believing that James had been simply one of many servicemen who had died in routine training accidents. The discovery that he had been a decorated combat veteran who had risked his life repeatedly to gather intelligence that saved the lives of ground forces transformed her understanding of his sacrifice and gave new meaning to the grief she had carried for 67 years. Torres explained that Margaret Chen had been conducting research into missing servicemen cases for 15 years, and that her investigation into James Mitchell's disappearance had been far more comprehensive than any official inquiry. He described Margaret's dedication to ensuring that no serviceman would be forgotten, her success in reuniting dozens of families with their loved ones' medals, and her current confrontation with federal authorities who were attempting to prevent her from continuing her research into classified cases. Patricia's reaction to learning about Margaret's situation was immediate and decisive. She stated that if Margaret Chen had spent 3 years researching her brother's case and had recovered his distinguished flying cross, then she deserved to know the complete truth about James Mitchell's disappearance, regardless of any government restrictions or classification policies. Patricia declared that she was prepared to demand answers from the Navy Department about her brother's final mission and the circumstances of his death. Torres contacted Margaret Chen directly from Patricia's apartment, using his cell phone to establish a three-way conversation that allowed the two women to speak for the first time. Margaret's voice was shaky with emotion as she heard Patricia express her gratitude for the years of research and her commitment to supporting Margaret's continued investigation. Patricia's voice was strong and determined as she told Margaret that her brother's story deserved to be told completely, and that no government agency had the right to prevent his family from learning the truth about his service and sacrifice. The conversation between Margaret and Patricia lasted for over an hour, during which Patricia learned about the systematic government pressure that had been brought to bear on Margaret's research, the isolation of her professional network, and the legal threats that had been made against her continued investigation. Patricia's response was immediate and unequivocal. She would travel to Sacramento to meet Margaret in person, and she would demand that the Navy Department provide her with complete information about her brother's final mission and the circumstances of his disappearance. Patricia's decision to travel to Sacramento was supported by the staff at Sunset Manor, who recognized the historical importance of her meeting with Margaret and the significance of her brother's story for the broader veteran community. The facility's administrator arranged for Patricia to be accompanied by a nurse during her trip, and veteran organizations in both Oregon and California coordinated to ensure that her travel would be safe and comfortable. The news of Patricia Mitchell-Brennan's decision to support Margaret's research and demand answers from the Navy Department spread quickly through the veteran networks that had been mobilized on Margaret's behalf. The veterans recognized that Patricia's involvement as Captain Mitchell's surviving family member would fundamentally change the dynamics of the confrontation with federal authorities, as the government would find it much more difficult to restrict research that was being conducted on behalf of a missing serviceman's family. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The successful location of Patricia Mitchell-Brennan represented a victory that transcended the specific case of Captain James Mitchell. It demonstrated that the veteran community possessed the resources and determination to overcome government restrictions and ensure that military families would receive the closure they deserved. The mobilization of veteran support for Margaret's research had achieved its primary objective, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether individual citizens had the right to seek truth about their government's actions. Patricia Mitchell-Brennan's arrival in Sacramento would mark the beginning of a new phase in the battle over Margaret Chen's research, and the veteran community was prepared to support both women in their quest for answers about Captain Mitchell's disappearance and the broader principle that no serviceman should be forgotten. Patricia Mitchell-Brennan's arrival in Sacramento on a Friday afternoon in December was coordinated with the precision of a military operation, but it carried the emotional weight of a family reunion that had been delayed by 67 years. The veteran community had organized every detail of her visit, from her transportation from the airport to her accommodation at a hotel near Margaret Chen's apartment, ensuring that the 84-year-old woman would be comfortable during what everyone recognized would be an emotionally demanding few days. Margaret was waiting in the hotel lobby when Patricia arrived, holding a small bouquet of white roses and feeling more nervous than she had since her first day of work at Travis Air Force Base 4 decades earlier. The two women embraced immediately, and Margaret found herself crying as she held the sister of the man whose story had become the most important case of her research career. Patricia's first words were simple but profound. "Thank you for refusing to let my brother be forgotten." The meeting between Margaret and Patricia took place in a conference room at the Sacramento Veterans Community Center, with Colonel James Patterson serving as a witness and Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez providing logistical support. Patricia had brought with her a small suitcase containing the only photographs she possessed of her brother James, along with the few letters he had written to her during his naval service. Margaret presented Patricia with the complete research file she had compiled, including declassified mission reports, squadron photographs, and testimonials from fellow pilots who had served with Captain Mitchell during the Korean War. The emotional impact of seeing her brother's military service documented in such comprehensive detail was overwhelming for Patricia, who had spent her entire adult life knowing only that James had died in what she believed to be a training accident. The discovery that he had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, that he had been recognized as an exceptional pilot, and that he had participated in dangerous reconnaissance missions that had saved the lives of ground forces transformed her understanding of his sacrifice and gave new meaning to the grief she had carried for decades. Patricia's presence as Captain Mitchell's surviving family member fundamentally changed the legal and political dynamics of Margaret's confrontation with federal authorities. When Agent Morrison contacted Margaret to schedule another meeting, he was informed that any discussions about Captain Mitchell's case would need to include his sister, who was now actively demanding information about her brother's final mission and the circumstances of his disappearance. The Defense Security Service could no longer treat Margaret's research as unauthorized civilian investigation when it was being conducted on behalf of a missing serviceman's family. The veteran community's mobilization of support for Margaret's research had been building media attention throughout the month, and Patricia's arrival in Sacramento provided the compelling human interest story that transformed the case from a bureaucratic dispute into a national news story. Investigative journalist Robert Kim's series of articles about Margaret's 15 years of research and her confrontation with federal authorities had been gaining traction in regional newspapers, but Patricia's personal story of discovering her brother's true military service after 67 years of being told only partial information created the emotional hook that captured national attention. The story was picked up by major television networks, with news crews arriving in Sacramento to interview Margaret, Patricia, and the veterans who had organized to support their cause. The visual impact of an 84-year-old woman learning about her brother's distinguished military service for the first time, combined with the story of Margaret's 15 years of dedicated research into missing servicemen, created a powerful narrative that resonated with audiences across the country. The media attention generated congressional interest, with several representatives and senators issuing statements supporting Margaret's research and questioning the government's restrictions on her investigation. Senator Barbara Martinez, who served on the Senate Armed Services Committee, announced that she would be requesting a formal review of the Defense Security Service's actions in Margaret's case, and that she would be holding hearings on the broader issue of government secrecy and its impact on military families seeking information about their loved ones' service. Though the political pressure created by the media coverage and congressional interest forced the Defense Security Service to reconsider its approach to Margaret's case. Agent Morrison contacted Margaret to inform her that the voluntary agreement that had been offered to her was being modified, and that she would be permitted to continue her research into Captain Mitchell's disappearance as long as she agreed to share any information she discovered with appropriate security agencies and refrained from publishing details that could compromise ongoing intelligence operations. But Margaret's response surprised federal authorities. She informed Agent Morrison that she was no longer interested in any agreement that would restrict her research or limit her ability to share information with military families. The veteran community's support had demonstrated that her work was valued by people who understood the importance of honoring missing servicemen, and Patricia Mitchell-Brennan's presence had confirmed that families deserved to know the truth about their loved one's service. Regardless of classification policies, the confrontation reached its climax when Patricia Mitchell-Brennan, accompanied by Margaret Chen and Colonel James Patterson, arrived at the federal building in Sacramento to meet with Agent Morrison and demand complete information about Captain Mitchell's final mission. Patricia's statement to the Defense Security Service was clear and uncompromising. She was Captain Mitchell's only surviving family member. She had the right to know the truth about her brother's service and sacrifice, and she would not accept any restrictions on research that was being conducted on behalf of her family. The meeting lasted for over 3 hours, during which Patricia was presented with classified information about her brother's final mission that had been withheld from his family for 67 years. Captain Mitchell had not died in a training accident, as his family had been told, but had been participating in a highly classified reconnaissance mission over the Pacific Ocean that was designed to gather intelligence about Soviet nuclear submarine capabilities. His F-A Crusader had been shot down by a Soviet interceptor aircraft, and his death had been classified to prevent an international incident during the height of the Cold War. Patricia's reaction to learning the truth about her brother's death was a mixture of grief, anger, and relief. She was devastated to learn that James had been killed in combat rather than in an accident, but she was also relieved to finally understand the circumstances of his disappearance and the reason for the government's secrecy. She expressed anger that her family had been denied this information for 67 years, but she also acknowledged that the classification had been necessary to prevent escalation of tensions between the United States and Soviet Union during a critical period of the Cold War. The revelation of Captain Mitchell's true cause of death vindicated Margaret's instincts about the case and confirmed that her research had been justified. The inconsistencies in the official records that had attracted her attention had been accurate indicators that the Navy pilot's disappearance had involved classified operations that were far more significant than a routine training flight. Margaret's persistence in pursuing the case despite government pressure had been rewarded with the discovery of information that provided Patricia Mitchell-Brennan with the closure she had been seeking for 67 years. The resolution of Captain Mitchell's case demonstrated that Margaret's approach to researching missing servicemen was both effective and necessary. Her willingness to invest years of effort in investigating individual cases had uncovered information that would never have been revealed through official channels, and her commitment to ensuring that no serviceman would be forgotten had provided closure to a family that had been waiting decades for answers. The broader impact of Margaret's confrontation with federal authorities extended far beyond the specific case of Captain Mitchell. The veteran community's mobilization of support for her research had demonstrated that military families and veteran organizations possessed the resources and determination to challenge government restrictions on information about missing servicemen. The successful resolution of the case had established a precedent that would benefit other families seeking information about their loved ones' service and sacrifice. The weeks following Patricia Mitchell-Brennan's meeting with the Defense Security Service marked a transformation in how government agencies approached cases involving missing servicemen and the families who sought information about their loved ones' fate. The national media coverage of Margaret's 15-year research mission and Patricia's discovery of her brother's true military service had created political pressure that forced the Pentagon to review its policies regarding the release of historical information about classified operations. Secretary of Defense William Harrison announced the establishment of a new office within the Department of Defense, specifically dedicated to assisting families of missing servicemen who had died in classified operations. The Missing Servicemen Family Assistance Office would be staffed by retired military personnel and civilian researchers who would work to declassify historical information that could be safely shared with families without compromising current national security interests. Margaret Chen was offered the position of senior researcher within this new office, recognition of her expertise and dedication to ensuring that no serviceman would be forgotten. Margaret's decision to accept the government position represented a remarkable transformation from the isolation and legal threats she had faced just months earlier. The veteran community's mobilization of support for her research had not only protected her from government restrictions but had also created opportunities for her to expand her work with official resources and institutional support. The wooden box containing 17 medals that had represented her private mission to honor missing servicemen would now become the foundation for a comprehensive government program designed to provide closure to military families. Patricia Mitchell-Brennan's decision to remain in Sacramento permanently, moving from her assisted living facility in Oregon to be closer to Margaret and the veteran community that had supported their cause, demonstrated the profound impact that learning the truth about her brother's service had on her life. At 84 years old, Patricia had discovered a new purpose in advocating for other military families who were seeking information about their missing loved ones. She began working with Margaret to establish a database of unresolved cases involving servicemen who had died in classified operations, the Distinguished Flying Cross that had belonged to Captain James Mitchell was formally presented to Patricia in a ceremony at the Sacramento Veterans Community Center, with representatives from the Navy Department, the veteran community, and the media in attendance. The ceremony was conducted with full military honors, including a color guard composed of retired naval aviators who had served during the same era as Captain Mitchell. Patricia's acceptance speech was brief but powerful, emphasizing that her brother's medal represented not just his individual courage, but the sacrifice of all servicemen who had died in missions that could never be publicly acknowledged. Margaret's weekly ritual at Meridian Park continued, but with a fundamental change in purpose and meaning. Instead of sitting alone with her wooden box of medals, she was now accompanied by Patricia and often by other members of the veteran community, who had joined her mission to honor missing servicemen. The park bench had become a gathering place for families who were seeking information about their loved ones, researchers who were working on missing servicemen cases, and veterans who wanted to support the effort to ensure that no serviceman would be forgotten. The success of Margaret's confrontation with federal authorities had created a ripple effect throughout the community of military families and veteran organizations. Families who had been searching for information about their own missing loved ones began contacting Margaret's new office, requesting assistance with cases that had been stalled for decades. The precedent established by Patricia Mitchell-Brennan's successful demand for information about her brother's service had encouraged other families to pursue their own investigations with the confidence that they had the right to know the truth about their loved one's sacrifice. That the broader impact of Margaret's work extended beyond individual cases to influence policy changes at the highest levels of government. The Department of Defense issued new guidelines requiring that families of servicemen who died in classified operations be provided with as much information as possible about their loved one's service, while still protecting legitimate national security interests. The guidelines established a presumption in favor of disclosure, placing the burden on government agencies to justify any restrictions on information that could be shared with families. Margaret's story had become a powerful example of how individual citizens could challenge government secrecy and achieve meaningful change through persistence, courage, and community support. Her 15 years of private research had demonstrated that important work could be accomplished outside official channels, and that the dedication of a single person could have far-reaching impact on the lives of military families throughout the country. The veteran community's mobilization of support for Margaret's research had created lasting changes in how military families approached their own searches for information about missing loved ones. The networks that had been established to support Margaret's case became permanent resources for families who needed assistance with research, legal challenges, or advocacy efforts. The success of their collective action had demonstrated that veteran organizations possessed the resources and determination to challenge government restrictions when those restrictions prevented military families from receiving the closure they deserved. Margaret's transition from private researcher to government official represented a unique form of public service that combined her personal mission with institutional resources. Her new position allowed her to continue honoring her promise to Robert, while expanding her ability to help military families on a scale that would have been impossible through private research alone. The wooden box that had contained 17 medals now sat on her desk at the Pentagon, serving as a reminder of the individual stories that had motivated her work and the families who were still waiting for answers. The story of Margaret Chen and Patricia Mitchell-Brennan had become part of the broader narrative about the relationship between military families and government secrecy, demonstrating that the demands of national security could be balanced with the rights of families to know the truth about their loved one's service. Their successful challenge to government restrictions had established important precedents that would benefit other families and researchers who were working to ensure that the sacrifices of missing servicemen would not be forgotten. Patricia's decision to donate her brother's personal papers and military documents to the National Archives ensured that Captain Mitchell's story would be preserved for future generations of researchers and military historians. The collection included not only the official records of his service, but also the personal letters he had written to his family, providing a complete picture of his life and character that would serve as a model for how missing servicemen should be remembered and honored. The universal message that emerged from Margaret's story was that individual commitment to honoring those who have served can overcome institutional barriers, and create meaningful change. Her 15 years of private research had demonstrated that ordinary citizens possess the power to challenge government secrecy, support military families, and ensure that the sacrifices of missing servicemen will not be forgotten. The veteran community's mobilization of support for her work had shown that collective action based on shared values could achieve results that exceeded what any individual could accomplish alone. Margaret Chen's promise to Robert that she would never let any serviceman be forgotten had grown from a personal commitment into a national program that would benefit military families for generations to come. Her story demonstrated that the most important work is often done by individuals who are motivated by love, loyalty, and an unwavering commitment to principles that transcend personal comfort or safety. The wooden box that had contained 17 medals had become a symbol of the power of individual conscience to create lasting change in the world. 5 years after Patricia Mitchell-Brennan's emotional reunion with her brother's distinguished Flying Cross, the Missing Servicemen Family Assistance Office had processed over 300 cases involving personnel who had died in classified operations spanning 7 decades of American military history. Margaret Chen, now serving as the office's director, had assembled a team of researchers, military historians, and family advocates who shared her commitment to ensuring that no serviceman would be forgotten, regardless of how long their cases had remained unresolved, or how deeply their stories had been buried in classified archives. The office's most significant breakthrough came when Margaret's team discovered a pattern of missing personnel files that had been deliberately scattered across multiple government agencies to prevent comprehensive investigation of Cold War reconnaissance operations. Working with Patricia Mitchell-Brennan, who had become the office's family advocate coordinator, Margaret's researchers developed new methods for cross-referencing personnel records, mission reports, and casualty databases to identify servicemen whose deaths had been misclassified or whose families had never received complete information about their loved ones' final missions. The database that Patricia had helped Margaret establish now contained over 1,500 individual cases, each representing a family that had been left with unanswered questions about their loved one's military service. The cases spanned conflicts from World War II through the War on Terror, including pilots who had vanished during reconnaissance flights over the Soviet Union, Special Forces operators who had died during missions in countries where the United States officially had no military presence, and intelligence officers who had been killed while conducting operations that remained classified decades after their deaths. Margaret's office had become a destination for military families from across the country who were seeking assistance with their own investigations into missing loved ones. The waiting room at the Pentagon facility was often filled with elderly parents, surviving spouses, and adult children who had traveled hundreds of miles to meet with researchers who understood the importance of their quest for answers. Each family's story reinforced Margaret's understanding that the need for closure transcended political considerations, classification policies, and bureaucratic convenience. The success of Margaret's work had inspired similar initiatives at the state level, with veteran organizations in California, Texas, Florida, and New York establishing their own missing servicemen research programs. These state-based programs focused on cases involving personnel who had been recruited from their regions, creating networks of local researchers who could provide personalized attention to families, while sharing resources and expertise with Margaret's federal office. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the retired Navy psychiatrist who had supported Margaret's original confrontation with federal authorities, had begun conducting research on the psychological impact of learning the truth about missing servicemen's deaths. Her study of over 200 families who had received information through Margaret's office revealed that even difficult truths about how their loved ones had died provided significantly more psychological healing than living with uncertainty and incomplete information. The research had influenced military family support policies throughout the Department of Defense, the veteran communities networks that had been mobilized to support. Margaret's case had evolved into a permanent advocacy organization called the Missing Servicemen Family Alliance. The alliance provided legal assistance to families who were challenging government restrictions on information about their loved ones, lobbied for policy changes that would improve access to historical military records, and maintained a database of volunteer researchers who could assist families with their own investigations. Margaret's story had become part of the curriculum at military academies and war colleges, where future officers studied her case as an example of how individual citizens could challenge institutional failures and create meaningful change through persistence and community support. The case study emphasized the importance of balancing national security requirements with the rights of military families to understand their loved ones' service and sacrifice. The international recognition of Margaret's work had led to consulting opportunities with allied nations who were facing similar challenges in providing closure to families of missing servicemen. The governments of Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom had requested Margaret's assistance in developing their own programs for investigating historical cases involving personnel who had died in classified operations during the Cold War and other sensitive conflicts. Patricia Mitchell-Brennan, now 89 years old, had become a powerful advocate for military families at congressional hearings and policy conferences. Her testimony about the impact of learning the truth about her brother's service, 67 years after his death, had influenced legislation requiring the Department of Defense to conduct comprehensive reviews of all cases involving missing servicemen whose deaths had been classified. Her presence at these hearings provided a human face to the abstract policy discussions about classification and disclosure. The annual memorial ceremony at Meridian Park had grown from Margaret's solitary Wednesday morning ritual into a community event that attracted hundreds of participants from throughout Northern California. The ceremony featured the reading of names of missing servicemen whose cases had been resolved through Margaret's office, presentations of medals to surviving family members, and speeches by military officials who acknowledged the importance of civilian advocacy in ensuring that no serviceman would be forgotten. Margaret's influence on military culture extended beyond individual cases to broader questions about how institutions should balance secrecy with accountability. Her work had demonstrated that classification policies designed to protect national security could sometimes become barriers to acknowledging the sacrifice of servicemen who had died in the service of their country. The precedent established by her successful challenge to government restrictions had encouraged other researchers, journalists, and family advocates to pursue their own investigations into sensitive military history. The wooden box that had contained 17 medals and launched Margaret's 15-year research mission was now displayed in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, where it served as a symbol of how individual commitment could create lasting change. The exhibit included photographs of Margaret's research process, testimonials from families who had received closure through her work, and documentation of the policy changes that had resulted from her confrontation with federal authorities. The long-term impact of Margaret's work was measured not only in the individual cases that had been resolved, but in the broader cultural shift toward recognizing the rights of military families to know the truth about their loved ones' service. The Missing Servicemen Family Assistance Office had become a model for how government agencies could work collaboratively with civilian advocates to achieve outcomes that served both national security interests and the needs of military families. Margaret's daily routine still included time for individual research, but her focus had expanded to training the next generation of researchers who would continue her mission after her retirement. The interns and junior staff members who worked in her office came from diverse backgrounds, but they shared her commitment to ensuring that no serviceman would be forgotten and that every military family would receive the closure they deserved. The story of Margaret Chen and Patricia Mitchell-Brennan had become part of the broader narrative about American military history, demonstrating that the most important work is often done by individuals who are motivated by love, loyalty, and an unwavering commitment to principles that transcend personal comfort or institutional convenience. Their successful challenge to government secrecy had established important precedents that would benefit military families and researchers for generations to come, ensuring that the sacrifices of missing servicemen would be remembered and honored, regardless of how long their stories had been buried in classified archives. 10 years after that first Wednesday morning when Margaret Chen sat alone on a park bench polishing Captain James Mitchell's distinguished flying cross, she received a letter that would define the true legacy of her work. The envelope was postmarked from Anchorage, Alaska, and bore the return address of someone named Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Mitchell Rodriguez, United States Air Force. Margaret opened the letter with trembling hands, immediately recognizing the significance of the name. Jessica was Captain Mitchell's great-niece, the daughter of his youngest nephew, who had been born 2 years after the pilot's disappearance. Jessica had grown up hearing whispered stories about her great-uncle James, the family hero who had vanished over the Pacific Ocean, but she had never known the complete truth about his service until Patricia Mitchell-Brennan had shared Margaret's research with the entire extended Mitchell family. The letter contained photographs of Jessica's promotion ceremony to lieutenant colonel, where she had worn her great-uncle's distinguished flying cross as a symbol of the family's continuing commitment to military service. Jessica wrote that learning about Captain Mitchell's true story had inspired her to pursue her own career in military aviation, and that she had dedicated her service to carrying forward the values of courage and sacrifice that her great-uncle had embodied during his classified missions over the Pacific. But the letter contained an even more significant revelation. Jessica informed Margaret that she had been selected to command a new Air Force program designed to investigate cases of missing personnel from recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. The program, called Operation Remembrance, had been modeled directly on Margaret's work with the Missing Servicemen Family Assistance Office, and Jessica had requested permission to name Margaret as the program's honorary advisor. Margaret shared Jessica's letter with Patricia during their weekly visit to Meridian Park, where they continued their tradition of gathering every Wednesday morning to honor missing servicemen. Patricia, now 94 years old and still sharp as ever, smiled with tears in her eyes as she realized that her brother's story had inspired a new generation of military officers to ensure that no serviceman would be forgotten. The park bench, where Margaret had first polished Captain Mitchell's medal, now bore a bronze plaque that read, "In honor of all missing servicemen and the families who refuse to let them be forgotten." The plaque had been donated by the veteran community that had supported Margaret's original confrontation with federal authorities, and it served as a gathering place for families who were still seeking answers about their loved ones' fate. Margaret's influence had extended far beyond the hundreds of individual cases her office had resolved. Military academies now taught courses on family advocacy and the importance of balancing national security with the rights of families to understand their loved ones' service. The precedent established by her successful challenge to government restrictions had been cited in dozens of legal cases involving access to military records and the declassification of historical information. Patricia Mitchell-Brennan passed away peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday evening in March, exactly 13 years after she had first held her brother's distinguished flying cross. Her funeral was attended by over 500 people, including Margaret, the entire veteran community that had supported their cause, and representatives from every branch of the military. She was buried in Sacramento National Cemetery with her brother's medal placed in her hands as a symbol of the family reunion that had been delayed by 67 years, but had finally provided the closure she had sought her entire life. Margaret continued her work at the Missing Servicemen Family Assistance Office until her retirement at age 85. having overseen the resolution of over 800 cases involving personnel who had died in classified operations. Her final act as director was to establish an endowment fund that would ensure the office's work would continue indefinitely, guaranteeing that future generations of military families would receive the support they needed to find answers about their missing loved ones. The story of Margaret Chen and Patricia Mitchell-Brennan had become a testament to the power of individual commitment to create lasting change. Their 15-year journey from a chance encounter over a polished metal to a comprehensive government program demonstrated that ordinary citizens possess the ability to challenge institutional failures and ensure that the sacrifices of missing servicemen would never be forgotten. If this story of courage, dedication, and never giving up on the people who served our country moved you, please hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell to join our community of viewers who believe that every story of service and sacrifice deserves to be told. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that persistence can overcome any obstacle, and that love and loyalty can change the world. Have you ever encountered someone whose quiet dedication made a difference in ways they never expected? Leave a comment below sharing your own story of unsung heroes. And if you know a military family who's still seeking answers about their missing loved one, remember that resources like Margaret's office still exist to help them find closure. Subscribe now, because every story of honor deserves witnesses, and every act of remembrance helps ensure that no one who served is ever truly forgotten.